Well, the topic of today is the practice of deliberately developmental facilitation in organizational development, the use of digital and analog tools to strengthen and critical reflection and enhance learning. It's a very difficult title, but basically the visual summarizes what it is about. When people look into the mirror, they often see something different than where they are in their own development. And that has huge consequences in how we work together, discuss together, shape the future together. And well, one of the key issues throughout my career has been how can I translate those exciting findings from research into practice, and how can I weave them into developmental projects within organizations so that large groups of people benefit from the use of developmental insights. Just for the people who do not know me, when I started to prepare this presentation, 2 weeks ago, I just became 60, and that's a moment where you have a brief reflecting back on what have you done until now. And basically, the point I'm at is the result of different trajectories that I went through. And in my trajectories, there are certain moments which were extremely important to understand where I am now. I started my career in 1984 as a researcher at the Catholic University of Leuven, focusing on the topic how people construct their thinking about innovation. And so we followed a kind of constructionist approach that was at that time practiced and researched at the University of Cleveland in the United States with Ron Fry, David Cooperrider, and some other persons. Later, that methodology and approach became the appreciative inquiry approach. In following my doctoral studies at the University of Leuven, I shifted work as an HR generalist. I quickly became an HR director at the age of 27. And one of the three blue points are three different companies I worked for. And it was the time in the later 80s and 90s where a huge focus went to competency approaches. And I must admit that that confused me. It confused me because there was a kind of a tension between the constructionist approach I discovered as a researcher and the practice in companies. But I quickly became an adept of competency profiling and translating the competency approach into all kinds of HR practices. Briefly, in the mid-90s, I was asked to contribute to the university as an executive professor, which I did for 2 or 3 years. But in 1998, I met Gillian Stamp. I had a meeting with her, and Gillian Stamp was one of the closest collaborators of Elliott Jaques. Elliott Jaques, a psychoanalyst who deeply went into stratified systems theory and capability research. These were very difficult words. And I must admit that my planned 1-hour meeting with Gillian Stamp took a bit longer and lasted for 5 hours. And after that meeting, I was left very confused because she argued that there was something more than competencies. There was a structure in the way people at different levels in companies were thinking differently. But it took me 7 years meeting Otto Laske to understand basically what was missing in Gillian Stamp's and Elliot Jaques' approach, namely the structures of thinking and how people shape reality, how they make an interpretation of reality. In the meantime, I was engaged in all kinds of board roles, and I found that important because I could have conversations with CEOs and board members on new kinds of developments and have open conversations on why they did not apply all those new insights into their companies. Nevertheless, I started a career as a consultant, as organizational development consultant. I started in 2000, now 21 years almost. And there are also 3 moments which were important in that career. In the beginning of my career, we held the license on the CPA methodology, the methodology of assessing capability of people, and we quickly left that methodology because we saw that there were things missing, but we couldn't lay our finger on what was missing on it. In 2010, I had the opportunity to contribute to a very broad organizational development trajectory of the Barclays Retail Bank in the UK, which was a group of 80,000 people, and I was asked to join the top transformation team to facilitate the transformation the bank needed to go through after the financial crisis. That shaped a lot how I started thinking about Otto's insights and about work levels, because in that project I worked together with Mark van Cleef, Roland Burgman, and Elizabeth Ferrer, a Canadian, an Australian person, and a South American person. And it was very curious to see how our different perspectives merged and brought something bigger than what we could do apart. And it is very rare that I'm able to join contexts in which I was part of a real winning team. And since then, I started myself asking the question, well, what makes a team a winning team? And what I found was that, well, we shared and discussed things in very different ways. But at that time, I was still in a learning trajectory with Otto, which shifted my perspective, but took again quite some time to find out how I could implement it in practice. In the meantime, I wrote 11 books, or I contributed to 11 books, and wrote about 90 articles, mainly Dutch. But my very first book in 1984 was based on my thesis and was on the question how we could change organizational culture, seeing culture as a way of thinking together, something that I could never implement in practice. And recently, well, I'm also Chief Executive Officer of, or Chief Ecosystems Officer of the Dynamic Collaboration Application and Network, a network now of 10 consultants, growing to 15 by mid next year. And well, the basic question throughout all those experiences was the question, how can I bridge the gap between assessing the vertical dimension? We have some tools that enable us to assess where people are in their development, both cognitively and social emotionally. But from assessing people to finding ways to put that into practice and to really help people grow, that was something that for me was quite a big step to make. And part of my introduction today is really about how did I bridge that gap. There are some tricky issues when you start working with what I would call adult development, or all kinds of approaches, systemic approaches of competencies, of systems, and use of systemic approaches in companies. And these have to do with the fact that the vocabulary is very different from what is used in research versus what is talked about in organizations. There is a real dominance of competency approaches. And somewhere I often felt lost in translation between the developmental insights and the practices in organization. My second experience was that if I tried to position myself as somebody that could help people assessing the vertical dimension, that I was confronted with a huge price pressure of assessing competencies. And people cannot really, people who are not familiar with the vertical dimension cannot immediately see the difference. And if a competency assessment, well, you can have a full assessment, at least here in Belgium, for 300 or 400 euros. Well, you cannot do a reliable and valid vertical assessment for that amount of money. So I've started thinking, well, we need to be able to digitalize that in a certain way. The third, and that's a kind of a tension I was confronted with, was a search for quick fixes and surface solutions in a lot of organizations. Most of my clients are very fond of two-dimensional schemes with immediate solutions for problems that I have not made explicit in a certain way, versus the in-depth developmental dialogues that you need to really help people to move to another level of thinking. And the last element that I saw was the real absence of integration of what I call the vertical dimension in business processes, in dialogue spaces. And that makes it very difficult to build a business case. And those three kind of drivers pushed me into the direction of thinking about a new set of analog and digital tools, and also to change deliberately the vocabulary we use as developmental schooled professional. For example, if you talk about other dependency, that's like talking Chinese to a competency, somebody who only understands the language of competencies. So building, speaking about context thinking, however evident for those familiar with it, is real far away from the experience of most people in organizations. So I needed to kind of look for a different language. So these were the tricky issues. So the vocabulary, the price pressure, the search for quick fixes, and the absence of the integration of the vertical dimension in business processes. And well, bit by bit, also by continued inspiration by Otto, I started to simplify the three essential interrelated questions, which have to do with how do I build a perspective as a role holder? What is the essential difference? So what is the structure I'm working in? And well, how do I allow dialogue to evolve to achieve more integrated decision-making? And those three are interrelated. And I needed to find tools to make that accessible very quickly. I started basically to reframe what I did towards companies, leaving out the word development, and started to talk about, well, the contribution of a collaborator, that's a medewerker, the collaboration issues in teams and strategy deployment at an organizational level. So these are three themes that have to do with the design of work. I started to reframe what I do as a consultant, and that has three levels: the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level, which I involve in the design of work and in making them conscious about the interpretation of work and how they well, make an interpretation of their work. So, and if you multiply contribution with autonomy, you get trust you build trust amongst collaborators. If you multiply collaboration with the alignment issues, you get productivity. And if you multiply strategy deployment with the framework, the blueprint of organization, you get value creation. And the developmental dimension influences all three at the same time. And it's based on this that a student of mine, Jan Bijen, invited me to think through how you could build a digital tool to grasp the complexity of the work and to objectify the interpretation of that work. So measuring accountability and measuring the interpretation of accountability. And that's, I will quickly show you how that works. I will go to the website. Okay, so people get, I won't go into the details of getting and signing in, but if you have, if you can sign in, there are two modules, a value mirror and a building your role kind of tool. And building your role is inspired by the storyline generator Rainer once developed, but here with the focus on the complexity of the work. And it works very simple. It's a tool to shift one's perspective-taking process on one's role. For example, if you would reflect upon the role as consultant, you can use some keywords, for example, facilitating development. And the words that you choose are derived from the stories that people tell when you ask them, well, what, if you come home tonight, what do you tell your wife or partner as having had a successful day today? And it generates a number of possible interpretations, often a very large diversity of interpretations, but that's an opportunity to think further, and you can detail the search process. And for example, you can find here facilitating transitions at an individual level. If you click on that, you get the sub-process appearing on top of the screen. You can say, well, it's not only individual development that is within my core responsibility. It's also team development. And you might get more possible interpretations. For example, facilitating change processes or defining responsibilities or defining the service management model. So you can get all kinds of interpretations. You can even go to another level, the organizational level, and you will then have perhaps even more possible sub-process responsibilities. For example, defining the nature, extent, and impact, setting goals, defining business models, and you create a cloud that enables you to ask questions such as, well, what is missing in that cloud? And then in a group, you have different words that pop up, for example, coordinating projects. And of course, that can mean different things, and you again get a list. So the search function works as a kind of a probing mechanism to derive what people mean when they use the word coordinating projects. For example, is that about coherence? Is that about the scope of project? Or is it managing project plans? And you select, you kind of extend the cloud of potential responsibilities. Of course, there can be other things and search words, for example, managing teams. If you do that, you will find again that can mean a lot of things, and that means, well, be a bit more specific. And for example, you could say managing team transition, which is more specific. And then you have a more limited clouds where you can click what is basically essential in the meaning making of the person. For example, words like I have a responsibility towards budget and forecasting. The system has about 5,400 different processes that can appear on the screen and provide interpretations of the words. And well, you can click on that what is applicable in your role. But if you do that with a group of people, of course, you get a rich discussion on what is the essence of a role and what is secondary in a role. Now, having selected the sub-processes, you still do not know what the complexity of the role is. And therefore, the system builds, by pushing on the button, build your role, in real time text that captures possibly the essence of the meaning making or the sense making of the person, where you can ask for, if somebody finds that too complex, more concrete, you can undo that. You can opt for a more challenge or even a variation. And these are pieces of text that are generated for the first time because the system is able to construct the storyline of more than 50 million different kinds of roles in the world. The system is built that the first sequence is about the accountability towards stakeholders and clients. Then if you say, yes, this is it, you go to the accountability towards innovation. You can go again, concrete, more challenge that follows out of the first and takes into account the basic concepts that a group or individuals have chosen. Then it asks for the accountability towards resources. And also here, you can, with some clicks, and the system is based on language models and semantic intelligence, so that the system basically thinks like a high-level McKinsey consultant or another consultant, capturing what might be essential in how one perceives his role. If you say, yes, this is it, well, then the last one is about the accountability towards planning and organizing. So you have now a storyline, yeah? And we know that in most contexts, people do not act upon their storyline. There is a difference between what people say they do and what they really do. Simultaneously with building the storyline, the system also captures the complexity of the role. And I will project the role that we just designed. So it gives a score, and that score refers to a contribution level, a level of complexity, which here is 2.9. Now, how can we make an assessment of a person that gives us a reliable and valid perspective on the level of dialectical thinking and the social emotional phase from which one operates, to say, well, that's sufficient and that will enable persons to fully act on that level or below or higher. And therefore we constructed a second application, which basically is based on the research by Hal Tona. That's a developmental researcher who focused on what is the relationship between the values that people find important and the level of complexity they can handle. And people are asked to make a selection out of a series of values in 3 steps. What values are essential to you personally, then what values best describe the context or the organization you work today, and what are the values you think contribute most to further development of your organization. The selection of values enables the algorithm, as you do as a schooled developmental interviewer, to form a hypothesis on the level of thinking. For example, we know from research that people choosing a value such as speed or discipline or order operate on average on a lower level of complexity than people choosing values like stakeholder integration or a profit margin model or a brand image. But it's not because you have chosen a word like transcendence or strategic alliances that you're fully aware what that means. So choosing the concept, as we know from developmental research, that concept can get from the person different levels of interpretations. And so the software designs a questionnaire in which those words are woven. Oh, it's now in Dutch, my apologies. But it constructs a series of questions that checks in what phase of identity development at the one side and at the other side, on which level of complexity one operates. And this leads to reports. I will now give you an example of no, I will not give the example. I will go back to the presentation that I have just to explain what we were doing. So now you should see again my presentation. Yes. So we have built a storyline generator that addresses the complexity, that helps you to assess whether roles are designed on the same or different levels of complexity. So that addresses the structure in which an individual operates. And that leads to repicturing the traditional organizational charts, and you get the information of which roles are designed in such a way that micromanagement, that bad communication, that territory fights start to appear in the organization. And you start to, you can then compare it with or bring it into a relationship with how individuals and teams score on the value mirror. For example, it enables you to picture not only the storyline, but also the problem handling score, which here is complying, means a basic logical analytical thinking. And from coordination, you have a variation of dialectical thought forms which are used, and where you get through a color, here yellow, and yellow means that that person already is mainly using process thought forms, but within a bandwidth of application. The same with the motivational field, which is a kind of script from which you function, which has to do with the role interpretation. And that gets a score here, 1.95, 2.65, with a role that is on 2.4. That means that from a perspective of identity development, that person is fit for the role, but from the development of thinking and fluidity of thinking, it's not yet the case. And following from those scores, we jumped to summarizing the whole field of different phases in core quadrants at the individual level, so that the patterns of sense making are brought to the surface. And those patterns are brought to the surface by confronting persons with 3 core quadrants. The core quadrant that they are leaving behind, the one that they are operating from, and the one they are growing into, so that they can start recognizing pitfalls and challenges, and that the situation is never black and white, that you're never in one operating from one developmental phase at the same time. From the team perspective level, you can, for example, this here is a real example from a top management team, or that from a top management team, where you see the spread in motivational field and the spread in problem handling, and the R&D team. And you can see that from first sight, you need not to be very, very familiar with developmental insights to see that something is not working well here. In terms of problem handling, that R&D team is mainly focused in the domain of coordinating things, and coordination is the main theme in continuous improvement. And also that top management is not able to go to integration, to new operational models, to new value streams, and even to redesign of the company. So introducing new technology, a new culture, and so on will be extremely difficult. So you have a kind of a way to objectify in a simple way, and making the assessment. We did a study where we used the Destiny methodology and the Three Houses methodology, and compare it with the outcome of the software to make a validation. And it enabled us to even fine-tune the validation so that we almost get to the same results. So we have a validity of about 0.84 of the methodology. And assessing through the software costs 120 euros, not more. So we are going below the level, the price setting of competency approaches, offering a more valid way to make a match between individuals and roles, but at the same time enabling ourselves to start discussing the role setup and the organizational structure. And why we do it is because in that organizational structure, people move from one role to another through growth assignments. That's how you bring people into their zone of proximal development. It's not through traditional coaching or through mental coaching, because the whole field of coaching has been kind of blurred by a lot of non-professionals. So you cannot really make the difference through developmental coaching, because the coaching field has been contaminated over the last 10 years. So you also need a new set of analog tools in order to change the dialogue dynamics. And those tools really bring people into the consciousness that when they speak with each other from the perspective of identity development, they speak through others. They are not aware that that a lot of people, and often themselves, function partially from an other dependent script or motivational field or driver's spectrum. So I'm using different words, but it's by reviewing the structure that you're able to start changing the meeting practices. And in doing that, I will not go into detail of how we do that, but I started more and more to focus on the forward-looking and the reflect-back dialogue moments, because these two moments are really essential and are insufficiently distinguished from, let's say, the contents people share daily and the kind of issues they share daily. The real sense-making or the real opportunity in introducing a higher awareness in sense and meaning-making is in those forward-looking and reflect-back dialogues, which I weave in the redesign of meeting practices. And in structuring that, I've developed a rethinking game, which basically is an operationalization of the work of Iva and Otto on dialectical thought questions. We lowered the threshold and started speaking about part whole thinking, dynamics thinking, coherence thinking, and metamorphosis thinking, because for engineers, for example, process thinking means quite something different than for us as developmentally schooled professionals. But if you must each time explain that you mean something different by process thinking, you already have lost the audience. And that's why I started to talk about dynamics thinking, being aware of the time dimension, the past, the current, and the future time, and the dynamics that are involved in it. At this moment, the second version of the Rethinking game has been published and is available on my site, which contains 80% different questions compared with the first version, because we, through practice in forward-looking and backward-looking moments, we experienced that a lot of questions were too abstract for people, especially for engineers who are purely logical thinkers. And you need to adapt the dialectical thought questions, but also the reflect back questions on identity development in words that people understand immediately. If the question is not understood, because I often got the reaction, well, what the hell are you asking me? I do not understand the question. Can you reformulate the question? And that's where you lose your public. And so the Rethinking game is a moment for me in the search of finding a different way to start discussing how we thought about an issue. It is about introducing the meta thinking and weaving it into organizational practices. And I will now focus on the forward-looking practices, for example, in strategic meetings, but also in project management and program management. If we make up the project charts, well, the Rethinking game enables you to build a more richer and fuller picture of the possible reality you will be addressing. And in the reflect back meetings, you can also use the game to engage everyone in that meta reflection. But that's the tool side. In, for example, rebuilding the dialogue spaces. In many companies, there is a huge practice development of program and project management. And one of the elements that is used is milestone follow-up. And in most program management approaches, one uses for reporting requirements 3 colors: the red, the green, and the orange. Meaning red, the milestone is not realized; orange, it's almost realized, but we are not yet on track; and green, we are on track. And what you see is that there is only a talking about the milestone as if a milestone is something that is really casted in stone. By broadening the colors and adding 2 tints, light green and dark green, you start inviting people to think, well, have we realized that milestone, but at the same time, have we broadened the scope and realized the milestone? Or have we realized the milestone, but basically narrowed our answer to the challenge that we were addressing? And that discussion on narrowing or broadening is kind of the opportunity that you introduce to start a developmental dialogue. The same with Orange. Orange is now considered as, well, we need to stop and reflect, but in practice, Orange is just, well, work a bit harder so that we realize the milestone, and does not always lead to in-depth discussions. In another example of a deliberate developmental intervention is, well, when you use the work level approach, you can rethink the competency scheme and basically redesign the competency scheme, taking into account role fulfillment at different levels of complexity. And so this gives a kind of a developmental pathway where people can say, well, you know, in encouraging stakeholder management, the second expression is not yet in my role, it's not applicable, but asking questions and listen closely, yes, that's applicable, but I only score a 2, perhaps I should go from a 2 to a 3, and that's a different kind of agreement than moving from the first column to the second column. And because you have taken into account the stepwise changes in competencies, you can start introducing how you need to think differently at the same time. The same for the identity development focused. With my team, I developed a landscape of identity development questions where people in a team choose the question in a kind of a reflect back workshop. What question might help them to discuss at that moment? And since in a team you always have people operating from different stages or phases, one will always be at a certain time be confronted with questions you have not reflected on together. For example, where and in what ways do I go against the group consensus? If in a reflect back moment they find that important to discuss, you get a different kind of exchange than when you exchange themes like where can we improve in how we give feedback with each other. So the latter is not developmentally, but purely behavioral, with these sets of questions. And we have derived a set of 75 questions now that we select upfront when we prepare for a reflect back section or a look forward session. But I also started to work with visuals. For example, in cognitive development, well, how do we evolve from looking at a part in the world to, well, starting to combine looking at parts with processes, with a kind of dynamic thinking, to weaving together different lines and different focuses and weaving it. So the metaphor of the second, the green one, is kind of dynamics thinking. The third one is coherence thinking. The last one is real metamorphosis thinking from well, how a butterfly is growing from a caterpillar. So we start to work with a lot of different kind of visuals. That brings me to the end of my introduction. My apologies that it took almost an hour. But for those who want to know more, next week on Wednesday, Otto and myself will share some recent insights and some case studies. Here I just shared some fragments on how I make the developmental approach workable in my organizational work.